Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are strapping in for one of the most fundamental, most complex, and frankly, one of the most enduring philosophical debates humanity has ever faced, the freedom of the human will.
It really is. And this isn't just some, abstract intellectual exercise.
Not at all.
It's the bedrock of morality, of responsibility, and even how you view your own ability to change.
Right. When we talk about free will, we're asking a huge question. Are you genuinely the uncaused author of your choices? Could you have chosen differently if you just rewound the clock?
Or are you maybe just a very, very sophisticated clockwork mechanism that's responding, inevitably to all the forces that came before? Our mission today is to cut through that confusion and give you a shortcut to genuine insight.
And the source we're using for this deep dive is, well, it's uncompromising. We're going straight into Arthur Schopenhauer's highly controversial essay, Preisschrift über die Freiheit des Willens.
Which means prize essay on the freedom of the will. It's rigorous, it's dense, and it is just relentless in its logic.
It was published back in 1841 as part of his work, The Two Basic Problems of Ethics. He actually submitted it to the Royal Danish Society, who had posed this very specific, very direct question.
And that question is key, they asked. Can the freedom of the human will be proven from self-consciousness? Can we prove it just by looking inside ourselves? Because that's the main piece of evidence we all think we have, right? That feeling of being free.
And spoiler alert, his answer was a hard, definitive no. Our goal is to unpack his radical claim that the will, in its actual observable actions, is entirely determined by necessity.
But, and this is the amazing part, he still somehow manages to make room for moral responsibility and genuine guilt. It's a masterful tightrope walk of an argument.
So we're going to follow his path exactly. He starts by defining his terms with surgical precision, separating the popular notion of freedom from the philosophical one.
Then we'll investigate where that illusion of choice comes from, which is, our own self-consciousness.
And then we move to the objective world, proving necessity through causality. And finally, we get to this higher view, this metaphysical shift based on Kant, which is where he finally locates true freedom.
It's quite a journey.
Okay, let's unpack this. The first step, and it's always the most important one in philosophy, is definition. Schopenhauer realizes that the way we normally talk about freedom is totally inadequate for the kind of rigorous concept you need for moral accountability.
That's such a crucial starting point. He begins by establishing that the core concept of freedom is fundamentally negative.
Negative. What does that mean?
It just means it denotes the absence of everything hindering and impeding. The positive thing is the hindrance, the obstacle. Freedom is just the lack of that obstacle.
I see. So it's not a power in itself, it's just a state of not being blocked.
Exactly. And because those obstacles can take different forms, he sets up 3 essential categories of freedom that we absolutely have to keep separate.
Okay, so let's start with the most intuitive one, the one we all think of first. Physical freedom.
Physical freedom is, well, it's simply the absence of material obstacles. You can think of it in nature. A free sky, free air, or a stream having a free run when it's not dammed up.
Okay, that makes sense.
So when you apply it to a person or an animal, it just means their actions aren't hindered by physical restraints. No chains, no paralysis, no prison walls.
So if I decide I want to stand up and walk across the room, and my body works and nothing's in my way, then I am exercising physical freedom.
Absolutely. That's the original, most common use of the word. And Schopenhauer points out that even something as complex as political freedom, a people governed only by their own laws, is really just a subset of physical freedom.
How so?
Because it means they're free from external, materially enforced obstacles to their collective will.
Right. So the key insight here is that this kind of freedom is only about the ability to act according to your will. It answers the question, can I do what I will?
Precisely. And for Schopenhauer, the answer to that is usually, yeah, sure, if you're not in chains, but that tells you absolutely nothing about why your will changed that specific thing in the first place.
Which is the real question. Okay, what's the second type?
The second is intellectual freedom. Now, he treats this one a bit like an appendix, but it's important. It's about the sanity and the clarity of your decision-making process.
So it's about the unhindered use of your intellect in presenting motives to your will.
Exactly. So if you're acting under some strong delusion or because of a mental illness or even in a moment of just blinding passion, what the Greeks called affect, your intellectual freedom is compromised.
Because the information driving your choice is distorted.
That's it. Your intellect is the medium through which your will gets its information. If that medium is, corrupt or cracked, then the will's reaction, while still necessary based on that distorted view, doesn't reflect who you really are in relation to reality.
Like mistaking a friend for an attacker in the dark.
Perfect example. The action stems from fear, but the motive, the representation of the person, was factually wrong. And most moral systems agree that actions taken when intellectual freedom is compromised are less culpable, right? Because the motive was based on a fundamental error.
Okay, that makes sense. So that brings us to the real heart of the matter. Moral freedom. This is the heavy-lifting philosophical concept. This is what people are really fighting about.
This is it. The technical term is liberum arbitrium indifferentiae, the free, indifferent decision of the will. And it is a truly radical concept when you unpack it.
What does it actually propose?
It suggests that an agent, at a specific point in time, under a completely determined set of external and internal circumstances, identical in every single respect, could still perform two diametrically opposed actions with equal possibility.
Wait, hold on.
That
That feels like common sense, though. If I'm standing here, surely I could choose to sit down or I could choose to stay standing just because I decide to. What's he arguing against there?
He's arguing that the moment you introduce that idea of an indifferent choice, you are implying the absence of necessity.
Okay.
And Schopenhauer defines necessity really rigorously. For him, necessity is simply what follows from a given sufficient ground. If a cause or a motive is the sufficient ground for an action, then the action must follow. It's not optional.
So if I choose to sit down, and in that exact same moment I could have chosen to stand up, then my choice to sit down can't have had a sufficient ground.
Exactly. If that choice were absolutely free in this moral sense, it would have to be absolutely contingent.
Meaning it depends on nothing.
Dependent on no ground or cause at all. It would just spring into existence out of thin air, spontaneously. And Schopenhauer calls this a highly problematic concept because it basically violates the entire logical structure of our thinking, the principle of sufficient reason.
So if every action is uncaused, the world just becomes a chain of inexplicable miracles.
Yes.
Right.
And that reframes the whole debate. The central distinction really boils down to this. Physical freedom answers the question, can I do what I will?
Right. Am I free from chains?
But true moral freedom, the kind you need for deep philosophical responsibility, has to answer the question that comes before that. Can you also will what you will?
Can you choose your own desires?
Exactly. And Schopenhauer insists that if you can't will otherwise, then you are not morally free in this indifferent sense. Period.
Okay, so with those definitions crystal clear, Schopenhauer turns back to that original question from the Danish Society. Can we prove this freedom just by looking inside ourselves through introspection or self-consciousness?
Right, the Bewusstsein des eigenen Selbst.
But wait a minute. Isn't he risking, just dismissing the strongest piece of evidence we have? Everyone feels like they could pick A or B when they're deliberating. Isn't he just tossing that out because it doesn't fit his definition of causality?
That's the tension his whole argument is built around. He absolutely concedes the feeling is real, but he argues that our self-consciousness is just inherently ill-equipped to answer a question about causality. He says that the vast majority of our consciousness is directed outwards. It's the Bewusstsein and der Dinge, the faculty of knowledge that deals with time, space, causality, mapping the external world.
So our minds are fundamentally structured to analyze external causes and effects, not to look at their own internal engine.
That's a great way to put it. He says self-consciousness is dark and dim inside. It's like a poorly lit room compared to the brightly lit world outside. What it does observe is primarily its own willing, the Willen.
Which includes all our desires, hopes, fears.
All of it. The whole inner dynamic tapestry. These are all just affections of the will.
And what does this introspection actually tell us about freedom?
It provides very, very limited data. All it tells us is, I can do what I will.
Which is just physical freedom again.
Exactly. It's that subjective feeling we talked about. But again, it only speaks to the consequences of the act once the will has already made up its mind. It gives you zero evidence, no a priori knowledge, that the will itself could have decided differently in that moment.
So he says the court of self-consciousness is incompetent.
Incompetent, because it can see the will, but it is completely blind to the causes of the will.
Okay, so this is where he explains the famous psychological trick, the illusion of free will. He says it comes from confusing wishing with willing. That seems like a small distinction.
It seems small, but it is the absolute key to the whole illusion. We can, at the same time, wish for totally opposite things. I can wish I had the discipline to go to the gym, and at the same moment wish I could just lie on the sofa.
Right.
But we can only will one of them. And which one that is determined by the strongest motive acting on our character. The actual wollen is the definitive, concrete resolution that moves your body. The Wünschen, the wishing, is just the stirring of the will toward multiple possibilities.
So the illusion happens when we're deliberating and we're just sort of watching our will flicker between these competing desires, and we mistake that temporary balance for genuine indifference.
Precisely. And he uses this wonderful detailed analogy to illustrate this, what you could call the weather vane analogy.
Oh, this is the one with the man at 6 p.m.
That's it. Imagine a man, he's finished his day's work, it's 6 p.m., and he's thinking about his options.
Right. He lists them out. I can take a walk. I can go to the club. I can go to the theater. Or I can run out into the wide world and never return.
And as he thinks about each one, the internal feeling is always the same. I can do what I will. That feeling of possibility is constant no matter how wild the option is.
But that's the error. He's just imagining different motives and feeling his will get pulled slightly toward each one.
Yes, that momentary pull is what Schopenhauer calls a velatus, a mere stirring. So when he thinks of the walk, his will swings a bit. When he thinks of running away, it swings the other way.
Like a weather vane on a well-greased hinge with an unstable wind.
Beautiful phrase, isn't it? And the man, watching this internal swinging, thinks he can just arbitrarily fix the vane at any point he wants, that he can just decide to turn a slight stirring, a velatus, into a determined act of willing, a voluntas.
But he can't.
He cannot. His actual choice, the voluntas, will be the inevitable result of the strongest motive acting on his pre-existing character. It's not a free choice, it's a necessary outcome.
He extends the analogy, too, with the water in the pond.
He does. The man's error is like water in a pond saying, I can be high waves, I can be a waterfall, I can be steam rising into the air. The water feels its own potential to become those things.
But it can only do those things if the determining external causes are there. The storm, the change in the landscape, the intense heat.
Once those causes arrive, the action is inevitable. It's necessary. And it's the same for the man. He needs a sufficient determining motive to push his will into a single actualized choice. That feeling, I can do what I will, just confirms that his body is ready to obey whatever the will eventually decides. It tells us nothing about what causes the will to decide.
Okay, so since self-consciousness is an unreliable witness when it comes to causality, Schopenhauer says we have to move outside. We have to look at the objective world, the world of experience, where we see the will's effects as objective phenomena.
And this external world, he argues, is governed from top to bottom by the most fundamental form of our understanding, the law of causality.
Right, and this is central to his whole philosophy. He says this law isn't something we learn from experience. It's a priori. We know it before all experience because it's the condition that makes experience possible in the first place.
It's the lens through which we see the world. And it applies to all changes in the objective material world.
And the implication of that is absolute, isn't it? Every change must have been preceded by a cause, and the effect must occur inevitably.
Inevitably. For him, necessity and following from a given sufficient ground are basically interchangeable terms. They mean the same thing. So if a motive is the sufficient ground, the action is necessary.
So to suggest a human action could just happen without a cause, to assume that liberum arbitrium indifferentiae is to propose.
What did he call it?
An inexplicable miracle, an effect without a cause. He says it's fundamentally unthinkable because it contradicts the very structure of reality as we can possibly know it. But obviously the world isn't uniform. You have rocks, you have plants, you have us. If causality governs everything, why do these things all behave so differently?
That's a great question, and he has an answer. He says causality applies universally, but it takes on 3 different forms which correspond to the different grades of complexity in the natural world. And this distinction is crucial for understanding how human beings fit into his deterministic picture.
Okay, let's break them down. What's the first form?
The first is cause in the narrowest sense. This is what governs inorganic bodies, so mechanics, physics, chemistry.
Like one billiard ball hitting another.
Perfect example. The cause, the physical impact, and the effect, the movement, are sort of homogeneous and palpable. You can see it, you can measure it. The necessity is straightforward and totally transparent.
Okay, simple enough. The second form is stimulus, or res.
This governs organic life plants and the involuntary vegetative functions in animals. Here, the cause and the effect are much more heterogeneous.
What do you mean by that?
Well, the cause can be very simple, like a bit of light or heat or water, but the effect can be incredibly complex and out of all proportion to the cause.
Like a tiny seed turning into a huge tree.
Exactly. A seed can be dormant for thousands of years, and then a simple stimulus of warmth and moisture makes it explode into this highly complex structure. But the necessity is still absolute. The seed must sprout if the conditions are met. The internal reaction is just far more complex than a simple mechanical push.
And that brings us to the third form, motivation, or motivation. This is the one that governs animals and humans.
Right. And here, causality is mediated through recognition, through consciousness, through an intellect. The cause is no longer a physical push or a chemical reaction. It becomes a mere representation, an idea presented to the mind.
And the moment causality starts working through the intellect, the connection between cause and effect becomes much harder to see.
Dramatically less apparent. And that, he says, is what makes it so easy to mistake this hidden complexity for freedom.
Okay, so we need to compare how motivation works in, say, a dog versus a human, because this is where people usually try to wedge freedom in, right? Human exceptionalism.
It is. Schopenhauer argues that animals are restricted to intuitive representations. They can only recognize what is right there in front of them, what's present to their senses. They react to the sight of food, the sound of a predator.
The choice is limited to what's immediately there.
Yes, and the stronger intuitive motive determines the movement with the same necessity as a mechanical effect. He says, no serious thinker would attribute liberum arbitrium indifferentiae to a cat chasing a mouse. The choice is dictated by the stronger appetite. It's necessary.
But humans, because we have reason, or Vernunft, we can access abstract concepts, thoughts, ideas.
Correct. Reason gives us an infinitely wider sphere of motives. A person can be motivated by a philosophical commitment, a legal principle, a fear about the distant future, a regret about the distant past, none of which are physically present.
And this capacity to deliberate between these abstract motives is what most people mistake for free will.
Yes. Less profound thinkers, as he would put it, see this complex internal process and just assume it must be uncaused.
But for Schopenhauer, this only changes the kind of causality. It doesn't touch the necessity of the effect. The causes are just hidden thoughts instead of visible objects.
Exactly. The human action that results from this conflict of hidden, abstract motives happens with the same calculable and unavoidable necessity as if you were dealing with a complex system of gears and levers. A man, he says, cannot stand up from his chair until a motive pulls or drives him away, and when it does, his rising is as necessary as a billiard ball rolling after it's been struck.
So deliberation isn't freedom, it's just the mechanism for weighing motives, letting the strongest one, which is itself determined, win out.
It's a necessary choice among necessary influences.
So if these external motives, whether they're abstract thoughts or a stimulus right in front of us, if they're the necessary external triggers, what's the internal factor? If the motive is the trigger, what's the gunpowder that actually explodes?
That internal factor is what Schopenhauer calls the character. He formalizes this idea, saying that every effect in nature is always the product of two things: an original underlying natural force, the internal part, and the external cause that triggers its expression.
Okay.
So in a human being, every single action, every thetan, is the necessary product of the character and the motive.
And given those two factors, the action follows inevitably. To get a different outcome, you'd have to change either the motive or you'd have to change the character.
Yes. And Schopenhauer is extremely specific about the qualities of the character, which when you put them all together, they really seal the deterministic fate of every individual action. He gives 4 qualities.
Let's go through them. The first one is individual.
The character is unique to every single person. He uses this great physical analogy. The same ray of sunlight will whiten wax, but it will blacken silver chloride. The same heat softens wax, but it hardens clay.
Right. Same cause, different effect, because the internal nature of the thing is different.
Exactly. And it's the same with motives. You present the same motive, say a bribe to 2 different people. The noble character rejects it. The greedy character accepts it. The action is determined by the motive in combination with that person's unique internal reaction mechanism, their individual character.
So you can't predict what someone will do just by knowing the motive. You also have to know their character.
You have to. And he says the moral difference between characters is as vast as the difference in intellectual abilities between people.
Okay, the second quality, empirical.
This is a huge one. The character is known only through experience. Crucially, you don't even know your own character a priori.
You don't know it in advance.
No. If you're faced with a really heavy moral choice, you can't just look inside and say with certainty what you will choose. You have to wait until you've actually done the action before you truly know yourself. And this slow, often surprising realization of your own limits is what leads to what he calls erworbener character.
Acquired character. But how can you acquire a character if its core is fixed?
It's not about changing it, it's about knowing it. Acquiring character means knowing your own empirical character so well that you know what you can and cannot trust yourself to do. It's self-knowledge, not self-transformation.
So a person with an acquired character has studied their own reactions, and now they can predict, and in a way manage, how they'll respond to certain motives.
That's it. If you know you have a weak character when it comes to, say, gambling, you actively avoid situations where that temptation will be present. And that avoidance is itself a necessary action, dictated by the motive of self-preservation, which is mediated by the knowledge of your character's limits.
That leads right into the third quality, which is maybe the most profound and,
Yeah.
well, the most fatalistic one: constant.
It is absolutely constant. This is where he famously states, man never changes. The identical, proper person remains the same throughout their entire life. Like a crab in its shell, he says, just underneath the shifting layers of age and knowledge and circumstance.
Wow, that is incredibly fatalistic. If a person never changes, what does that do to all our ideas about rehabilitation or getting a fresh start? What does regret even mean?
That's the core ethical tension he's setting up. He argues that regret, or what we call conscience, doesn't point to the possibility that you could have acted differently. It points to the immutable wickedness of the character that committed the act.
So you regret what you are, not what you did.
Yes. And this constant core is why a single unworthy act can stick to a person forever, like a brand. You know the proverb, he who steals once is a thief all his life. The character remains the source of that potential action. Always.
Okay, if the character is fixed and constant, what's the point of education or moral influence? If I have a vicious character, you can't just talk me into being a virtuous.
You can't. He's very strict on this. The sphere of improvement lies exclusively in the knowledge, the urgentness, that mediates the motive. Trying to change a character flaw with moral speeches is, he says, like trying to turn lead into gold or making an oak tree bear apricots.
So the will, the character, its fundamental striving is fixed.
But education can work by correcting the intellect. It can show the individual better means to achieve their fixed underlying ends.
So if my underlying essence is selfishness, education can't make me selfless. But it might teach me that the most effective way to be selfish in the long run is through honesty and cooperation.
Precisely. It's a shift in strategy, not a shift in essence. Education opens a person up to motives they were previously closed off to because they misunderstood the consequences. This intellectual correction acts as a stronger countermotive, causing the necessary, inevitable action to change, even though the internal character is exactly the same.
And the fourth and final quality, character is inborn, Engeborn.
Virtues and vices are inherited and innate. He says the inclination to justice or temperance or bravery exists from the moment we are born. He even quotes the Roman historian Velleius Paterculus on Cato. It's a powerful example.
Was the quote.
He never acted rightly merely to seem to act rightly, but because he could not act otherwise. For Schopenhauer, the fundamental moral quality of a person resides in this fixed, unchosen, inborn core.
This all brings us back to that foundational principle he mentioned, the one that binds everything in the objective world. A priori sequitur esse.
Action follows from the being. The external causes, the motives, will necessarily bring forth what is inherent in the nature of the thing because it can't react in any other way than according to what it is. The character is the essence, the essentia, and the action is just the necessary execution, the a priori. The necessity of the action is derived directly from the necessity of the being.
So at this point, Schopenhauer's argument on the empirical level is complete. The individual action is necessary. And then he insists, I'm not alone in this. He says all the truly deep thinkers have agreed on the necessity of the will's acts.
Yes, and he launches into this rapid-fire review of his predecessors, turning this whole section into a kind of narrative about philosophical integrity versus superficiality.
He starts with theologians, right? Even before the philosophers.
He does. He mentions figures like Jeremiah, but his main theological focus is Martin Luther, and specifically Luther's work, De Servo Arbitrio on the Bondage of the Will.
And Luther argued so fiercely against Erasmus's defense of free will, saying that if you assert free will, You're basically denying the omnipotence and omniscience of God.
Absolutely. For Luther, if God knows in advance what I'm going to choose, then my choice is predetermined and therefore necessary. If the human will were truly indifferent, God's power would be contingent on human whims, which from a theological view is just absurd.
So Schopenhauer is positioning his own rigorous philosophy as being in line with this profound religious conviction.
He is, and then he moves to the great system builders, like Thomas Hobbes.
What was Hobbes's contribution?
Hobbes was critical. He argued that nothing takes a beginning from itself. The will is always necessarily caused by external things. He insisted that all voluntary actions have necessary causes and are therefore necessitated. To think otherwise is to violate the basic logic of cause and effect.
And Schopenhauer highlights Hobbes's definition of a free agent, which is just this beautiful, concise takedown of the whole concept of indifference.
It's perfect. Hobbes defined a free agent as one who, even when everything necessary is present to produce an effect, can still choose not to produce it.
Which is a contradiction in terms.
A total contradiction. Hobbes called it nonsense. It's like saying a sufficient cause is present, but the effect might not follow. It's illogical. Hobbes concluded, every accident, how contingent soever it seem, is produced necessarily.
And then, of course, there's Spinoza, whose determinism is maybe the most famous of all.
Spinoza's doctrine is that the will is a necessary cause, not a free one. And he used that famous stone analogy, which illustrates the deception of self-consciousness so perfectly.
Remind us of that one.
A stone is set in motion by an external cause. If that stone were conscious, but only conscious of its own striving to move, and totally ignorant of the external push it received,
it would believe it was entirely free. It would think it was moving just because it willed to.
Exactly. And Schopenhauer quotes Spinoza's famous conclusion from this. And this is that human freedom, which all boast of possessing, and which consists solely in this, that men are conscious of their volition, but ignorant of the causes by which they are determined.
He also mentions Spinoza's thoughts on Buridan's ass.
He does. It's a fascinating detail. Spinoza initially argued against the idea that the ass, placed between food and water, would die. But later he conceded that, yes, such a person would die of indecision because the balanced motives would necessarily lead to inaction. This just highlights how difficult it was, even for these great minds, to fully accept the doctrine.
And he also notes the conversions of other brilliant minds, Priestley and Voltaire.
Dr. Joseph Priestley, the chemist, wrote a whole book on it, The Doctrine of Philosophical Necessity, and Priestley said clearly, without a miracle, no volition or action of any man could have been otherwise than it has been. And what makes his testimony so powerful is that he admitted he wasn't a ready convert. He gave up his belief in liberty with great reluctance.
He was compelled by the evidence.
He was. And Voltaire, ever the witty observer, summed it all up later in his life.
He had defended free will earlier, hadn't he?
He had, but then he declared in Le Philosophe ignorant. The fool who thinks thus has not always thought so, but was finally compelled to surrender. He concluded a man is determined in all his actions just as necessarily as a billiard ball or a hunting dog.
So Schopenhauer is using this whole lineage to say, look, my findings aren't some weird arbitrary idea. This is the conclusion every truly deep, non-superficial mind reaches when they seriously investigate the problem.
But this is where the story gets really juicy. Because Schopenhauer wasn't just making an academic argument, he was fighting the philosophical establishment of his day. The Royal Danish Society initially rejected his essay.
And they cited his unseemly mention in Decenter Commemorare of outstanding philosophers.
Summi Philosophi. And the targets were primarily Fichte and, most scandalously, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who was the absolute titan of German academia at the time. The Danish Society was basically scolding him for insulting their heroes.
So Schopenhauer uses the preface to his book to launch this spectacular, completely unapologetic counterattack.
He does. He denies that Hegel is a summus philosophus at all. He calls him an unusual charlatan and says Hegel had a highly destructive, indeed properly stupefying, one might say, pestilential influence on German thought. It was a radical act of intellectual defiance.
And to prove his point, to prove that the Danish Academy was wrong to call Hegel a supreme philosopher, Schopenhauer pledges to prove Hegel lacked even common sense.
Gemeinen Menschenverstand. He does this by citing 3 specific examples from Hegel's Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences that show a basic misunderstanding of physics.
Let's hear them. The first one is about gravity and inertia.
Hegel claimed that gravity directly contradicts the law of inertia because matter strives out of itself towards the other. Schopenhauer just demolishes this with basic physics. Inertia says no change happens without an external cause. Gravity is an external cause. It's a force.
It's perfectly consistent with inertia.
Perfectly. Schopenhauer points out that to deny inertia is to assume an effect without a cause, which is, in fact, the exact error that the idea of free will makes. He's turning Hegel's bad physics back on the whole ethical debate.
Brilliant. What's the second proof?
It attacks Hegel's concept of matter itself. Hegel questioned the permanence of matter, calling the belief that matter is eternal and indestructible an error.
Which is a pretty fundamental law of physics.
It's an a priori certainty, Schopenhauer says. It's as fixed as a mathematical truth. It's a necessary presupposition for our understanding of the world. To deny it is to renounce all understanding.
And the third critique is more linguistic, aimed at the word Spiritgeist.
Yes, which was the central term in Hegel's whole system. Schopenhauer was deeply cynical about this trend. He links the word Geist etymologically to gas, vapor or air, and suggests that its vague use was just a cover for cowardly poverty of thought.
He saw the whole Hegelian system as an apotheosis of nonsense.
Total nonsense, lacking the clear, rigorous, empirical foundation that he himself was championing through the necessary laws of causality. So he used this whole section not just to prove his point, but to defend his intellectual integrity against what he saw as the dominant irrational philosophy of his time.
Okay, so having established with just airtight rigor that every single one of our actions is completely necessitated.
A product of fixed character and a given motive.
He now has to perform his most critical philosophical maneuver. He has to address the undeniable, powerful feeling of responsibility.
The Verantwortlichkeit. This is the moment of maximum tension in the whole essay.
Because we all have this clear and certain feeling of accountability for what we do.
Yeah.
When we do something cruel or generous, we can't just shrug and say, well, it was necessary. Guilt feels like a direct confirmation that we could have done otherwise.
So if necessity reigns, where does responsibility live? This feeling is the key piece of data that prevents Schopenhauer from just being a simple fatalist. He says, since responsibility is a real feeling, the freedom it points to must exist somewhere.
And he locates this freedom not in the action itself.
Not in the empirical action, which is determined, but in the character itself, in the immutable being, the esse of the person.
Now, this sounds like pure metaphysics. He's built this completely inescapable cage of necessity based on causality, and now he's saying there's an escape hatch.
It is the escape hatch. And he frames it using a foundational distinction made by Immanuel Kant, the distinction between the empirical character and the intelligible character.
Okay, let's delineate those two very clearly.
The empirical character is the person as you observe them in time. It's the necessary expression of their will, and it's totally subject to the law of causality. This is the person you see acting, and every single action they perform is necessary.
Okay, that's the person in the real world.
Yes. The intelligible character, on the other hand, is the will in itself. It's the core essence, the esseo of that person. And this essence exists outside of the phenomenal world and its limiting forms: time, space, and causality.
So causality, the very law that makes all our actions necessary, is just a framework for our experience of the world. It's not some internal truth about the underlying nature of things.
Exactly. Causality is a form of the phenomenal world, just like time and space are. And if the intelligible character exists outside of those forms, then it is independent of causality, and therefore, it is free.
So what's the connection between this free essence and our necessary actions?
The individual only acts necessarily because, as he says, he is what he wills. The action flows necessarily from his fundamental essence. Every single empirical action you perform in your life is just the unfolding necessary manifestation of that one timeless, uncaused, free act of your intelligible character choosing its own nature.
Wow, okay, that is a remarkable shift. So my individual actions are necessary because they're like the shadow cast by my free, transcendent essence.
That's a perfect way to put it.
So when I feel guilt, I'm not regretting the necessary action itself. I'm regretting the being that freely chose to be the kind of thing that was capable of that action.
That is the final synthesis, and Schopenhauer concludes, freedom is not abolished, but merely shifted from the domain of individual actions, where it is demonstrably not to be found, up into a higher region, i.e., it is transcendental.
So a person always does only what they will, and yet they do it necessarily. The necessity is in the action, the a priori, which happens in the empirical world of cause and effect.
And the freedom is in the essay, the being, which is the intelligible character, the pure will that exists independent of those constraints. Moral accountability resides at this transcendent level. You are responsible for the being you are, that fundamental, fixed, inborn character, which then dictates all of your inevitable actions throughout your life. Hashtag outro.
This has been just a profound exploration through one of the most intellectually demanding arguments in all of philosophy. Schopenhauer builds this seemingly inescapable prison of necessity, only to reveal a transcendental escape clause at the very end.
So let's review the key takeaways for you. First, Schopenhauer rigorously defined and then completely dismantled the common sense idea of moral freedom, the liberum arbitrium indifferentiae. He argued that absolute contingency is just a philosophical impossibility.
Second, he proved the necessity of every single empirical action by analyzing the law of causality. He showed that motivation is just a complex, mediated form of cause and effect, and that the internal factor, the unchanging inherited character, is fixed.
So everything that happens, from your greatest triumph to your smallest mistake, as he says, happens strictly necessarily.
And third, he saved moral responsibility and the reality of guilt by shifting true freedom to that transcendental realm of the intelligible character. He argued that you are responsible for the being that you are, the fixed essence that dictates all your actions in the phenomenal world.
And this leads to a really critical practical application for how we live our lives. Since the character is constant and unchangeable, the only thing that can ever improve is the knowledge that mediates the motive. You can't change your will's essence, but you can change the quality of your intellect.
Which means that moral influence and education work entirely by correcting the intellect. It's all about providing clearer, more accurate knowledge of the world and the consequences of actions, which gives you stronger, more effective counter-motives.
So if a person has a strong innate tendency toward cruelty, education can't make them not cruel. But it might teach them the sophisticated long-term consequences of that cruelty, which generates a stronger, necessary motive toward restraint, even if the underlying tendency never changes.
It forces a complete relocation of our focus. If we want to change outcomes, we have to correct the information, not try to coerce the will's essence.
Indeed. Schopenhauer asserted that wishing that some incident had not occurred is a foolish self-torment, for it means wishing something absolutely impossible. Since everything happens strictly necessarily, quid fit, necessario fit, what does this perspective actually do to regret, to guilt, to the pursuit of self-improvement?
If you really accept that every past event, including your worst mistake and your greatest triumph, was strictly necessary given who you are and the circumstances you were in, does acknowledging that necessity provide a source of comfort, a kind of tranquility like some of his predecessors believed?
It's a profound question to leave you with. If the will is free only transcendentally and all its actions are necessary empirically, does accepting this necessity represent the ultimate form of peace? Or does this determinism simply relocate the focus of your struggle from changing what you do to changing what you know? Something for you to mull over until our next deep dive.